This program is brought to you by Emory University.
It's a great privilege and pleasure for me to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Álvaro Alonso, who I'll tell you a little bit about him, although he has spoken here many times. Álvaro is now Clements Chair of Cardiovascular Diseases and Prevention at School of Public Health. He earned his MD and PhD in epidemiology at the University of Navarra in Spain, and had some postdoctoral research training at the Harvard School of Public Health in Boston with a Fulbright scholarship, after which he was on faculty for many years at University of Minnesota before he came here. Among the many things he works on have been PREDIMED study. He's part of the Goizueta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, the ARIC study, and the All of Us study. And he's going to talk to us today about racial differences in atrial fibrillation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So today I'm going to talk to you about atrial fibrillation. A lot of the work I have been doing for the last 15 years focuses on the epidemiology of atrial fibrillation. And specifically today, I just want to talk to you about some things that many people sometimes don't realize about AFib, some very important aspects about its epidemiology that sometimes are unrecognized. And a lot of the slides I'm going to be talking about are about epidemiological studies. I'll be talking to you about these different studies, but if you have any questions, this is a small group, so you can interrupt me while I'm talking. We don't need to wait probably until the end. That's fine, and we'll finish by 3, and where we are then we'll finish. Okay. And maybe we finish earlier, probably not. I talk too much. So let me just do this. I don't have any disclosures other than some NIH funding and past American Heart Association funding. So just getting started, just to put things in perspective a little, probably I don't need to talk to the audience here what atrial fibrillation is, so I will skip that part. And I'm just going to highlight to you the relevance of atrial fibrillation as a public health problem. There have been multiple studies that have tried to estimate the number of people living with AF. This is one of the most recent ones. This little thing from here to here, so you can see the references. This is a recent study that was published in JACC in 2024, in which Craig Marcus and others from UCSF used data from California health databases to estimate the number of people living with AFib in the US, and they came with these estimates from over 10 million people based on census data from 2019. Here in the right side, you can see the actual numbers of people across different age groups, and you can see that most of people living with AF are older individuals. You can see here also the prevalence overall is 4.5% in the US population, with some differences by sex, and then obviously the prevalence increasing strongly as people get older. In addition to being a relevant problem because of the large number of people living with AF, we know that obviously that atrial fibrillation is a strong recognized risk factor for a stroke, but not only a stroke. We know also that people with atrial fibrillation have a much higher risk of developing heart failure. They have a higher risk of developing MI, and they also have higher mortality rates than people with AF. This is a review that was just recently published in JAMA, highlighting some of the relationship between AFib and outcomes. And you can see that just highlighting from a meta-analysis that was a relative risk of 2 for a stroke in people with AF compared to people without AF, a relative risk of 5 for heart failure, much stronger than for a stroke, and also some increased risk of MI and mortality. And when you look at the 5-year risk of people living with AFib of developing these different outcomes, you can see that particularly for heart failure, you have a very high cumulative risk of this outcome. So all these things highlight that studying atrial fibrillation is a relevant question. Just to highlight some of what epidemiological studies and clinical studies have told us about the risk factors for atrial fibrillation. We know that people with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, other cardiovascular diseases like heart failure and CHD, and people who smoke have a higher risk of atrial fibrillation. We also know that there are multiple genetic variants that are associated with an increased risk of atrial fibrillation. And in the last 10, 15 years, there have been multiple studies that have identified more and more genetic variants. We know that people with a family history of atrial fibrillation have a higher risk also of developing atrial fibrillation. And here in the right side, in this figure, what you have is an estimate of the population attributable fraction of atrial fibrillation for selected risk factors. This is an analysis we did in the ECCRI study, and you can see that based on the studies from this analysis from this cohort, up to 25% of the AFib risk in the population can be attributable to high blood pressure, almost 20% to BMI as the two major risk factors for AF, and then you have some other modifiable risk factors there. So we know some of the risk factors that are going to be associated with atrial fibrillation. So that's just to give you a general idea of where we are in terms of what we know about what causes or what can be associated with atrial fibrillation in the general population. Just changing a little here, one thing that I haven't mentioned when I have been talking about the risk factors for atrial fibrillation, I haven't said anything about how race and ethnicity may be associated with atrial fibrillation. And you know very well that here in the US, we have very strong disparities in terms of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular health pattern by race. So for example, this is data looking at more age-adjusted cardiovascular mortality in the US for Black and white people. And you can see that over time, even though there have been decreases in the mortality due to cardiovascular disease across the population, there have been persistent disparities in those mortality rates, with overall higher mortality rates in Black individuals compared to white individuals. We know also that there are important disparities across not only cardiovascular mortality, but also across multiple cardiovascular risk factors. For example, we know that hypertension, obesity, diabetes are going to be more prevalent in Black people compared to white individuals. And also we know that Black individuals have higher rates of CAD, stroke, heart failure. So with all this and all these known disparities and what I have been mentioning about the epidemiology of atrial fibrillation, you will expect that when you look at the prevalence and incidence, the risk of atrial fibrillation in the population, you will see in general higher rates and higher prevalence of atrial fibrillation in Black individuals compared with white individuals, because they have a higher prevalence of the cardiovascular risk factors for AFib, and you can see that pattern for other cardiovascular diseases. However, actually, when we look at this in the population, we see that the opposite is the actual findings we get. So this work on this, trying to understand to first of all describe the patterns in the prevalence and incidence of atrial fibrillation by race have been happening over the last, I would say, the last 15 years. Here you have results from one of the first studies that show, and probably this was the first study that showed difference in the incidence rates of atrial fibrillation by race in a prospective study. This is an analysis we did in the ECCRI cohort we published back in 2009. So for those that are not familiar with this cohort, this is a prospective study that includes around 16,000 people that were enrolled back in the late 80s. These people were 45 to 64 at baseline, and the main goal of the cohort was really to study cardiovascular risk factors for the development of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. One particular fact of this cohort compared to other previous cohorts funded by NHLBI is that it included a relatively large number of African-American individuals. There were around, of the 16,000 individuals, around 14,000 were African-Americans. The rest were mostly white people. And at that time, we were able to start looking at the incidence of atrial fibrillation in the cohort. That wasn't something that had been done. And when we started calculating the incidence rates, what we found is that overall, all the incidence rates of AFib for Black people, Black participants compared to the white participants were overall lower when we were looking across the different age groups. You can see that here. And when we adjusted for cardiovascular risk factors, which were more prevalent in the Black participants compared to the white participants, those differences even became larger. So this was one of the initial studies that described this association. Overall, we found that the rates were 30–40% lower in Black participants compared to the white participants. We did a latest analysis looking at the lifetime risk of developing atrial fibrillation in this cohort, and we did this also by race, comparing white and Black participants separately. And what we found is that in white individuals, which could be the top line in this figure here to the right, the lifetime risk of developing AFib was around 35%, which is actually the same number that the Framingham study has described in their more recent estimates. So that was very similar. And we also found that because there is this lower incidence rate of atrial fibrillation in the Black participants, the lifetime risk of atrial fibrillation was around 20% or so in that group. You could say, well, this is just this cohort, and maybe this is something that we wouldn't see anywhere else. Actually, there have been multiple different cohort studies that have found similar patterns. So just to give you two examples here, this figure in the top right, these are results from the MESA cohort. This is another NHLBI funded cohort that includes around 6,500 people. The MESA is the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, and it includes non-Hispanic white individuals, Chinese Americans, non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic individuals. And that's across 6 sites in the US. So an analysis that was done in this cohort, also looking at the incidence rates of AFib by race and ethnicity group, also identified a lower rate, the highest rate of atrial fibrillation in the non-Hispanic group individuals, and then lower rates in all the other groups. So you can see, so this could be in the y-axis, you have the incidence rates per 1,000 person years, and then you have these different bars correspond to different age groups. And for example, if you look at the group with the highest rates, which will be those 75 to 84, you have rates that are around 2% in non-Hispanic white participants and less than half of that in the other groups. We also did an analysis in the All of Us research program using the data that has been collected that includes both self-reported and EHR data. And here you can see the odds ratios for prevalent AF and the hazard ratios for incident AF in different race and ethnic groups compared to non-Hispanic whites. So again, looking at the non-Hispanic Black specifically group, you see that the odds ratios was, the odds of having AF was around 36% lower, and the Black participants had a 45% lower risk of AFib compared to the white individuals. So just to show you a couple of epidemiologic studies, a similar pattern has been described when looking at administrative databases and EHR databases. So just here you have another 3 different examples that show the same pattern. Here to the left, you have an analysis that was done using Medicare claims data. This was published by Jonathan Piccini from Duke University, I think he's there. This followed participants in Medicare from 1993 to 2007. And what you can see here is the prevalence of atrial fibrillation over time in this population separated by race. And overall, you can see that the prevalence is much lower in the Black Medicare enrollees compared to the white and those that were classified as having other or unknown race. And this pattern was very similar, not only when looking at prevalence of atrial fibrillation, but also when looking at the incidence of atrial fibrillation. This analysis in the top here is an analysis done by Greg Marcus's group at UCSF using data from databases from ECCRI from California for the period 2005-2009. And again, they looked at these different ethnic groups, and what they are reporting here are the hazard ratios of developing atrial fibrillation in Black, Hispanic, and Asian individuals compared to the white individuals. And you can see that overall, these numbers are kind of small, but once you adjust, and even without adjusting for risk factors, again, the rates of atrial fibrillation were lower in all these other groups compared to the white individuals. And finally, this is a recent publication using data from Epic Cosmos, which, as you know, is the platform that pulls together all the Epic EHR data that is accessible for researchers. And in this case, they also looked at the prevalence of atrial fibrillation using information recorded in Epic and using the race information that is recorded there. And they found that the prevalence of atrial fibrillation was much lower in the individuals that reported race as Black, Asian, and others compared to the white participants. Notice, though, that this is unadjusted odds ratios. These are not adjusted for age, sex, or anything, but even when they adjusted for demographic variables and and clinical variables, they also found this lower prevalence of AFib in these groups compared to the white individuals. one thing that you could say, well, is that the problem with AFib diagnosis is that because there's a lot of subclinical AF, people have paroxysmal, they may be undiagnosed. Maybe what we are finding when we look at this clinical data is that some cases are not being diagnosed, they are left out from this. So to address questions about that, there have been some studies that what have tried to do is to use extended ECG monitoring to determine the prevalence of not only of clinical AF, but also of undiagnosed AF. So for example, this is an analysis that was done also in the ERIC cohort. This was led by Lin Chen, who is a cardiologist at the University of Minnesota. And he had this grant from NIH to administer the Zio patch, which is a 14-day ECG monitor that people can wear during that time, and it's going to record your ECG, and then you can process and identify the presence of arrhythmias, including atrial fibrillation. So this was done in around 2,600 participants at that time, and what you can see in this table is the main results from that study. So you can see the distribution of participants by sex and race. So even though it wasn't a very large group of Black participants, you have almost over 600 that wore this monitor for 2 weeks. And what you can see is that independently of how we define atrial fibrillation, which is just the prevalence of subclinical AF, that is AF that had not been diagnosed before, or of clinical AF that includes whatever was identified with the Zio patch plus prior history of AFib, or only that was identified with the Zio patch. All the numbers that you can see here looking at these different prevalence rates were lower in Black individuals compared to white individuals, also suggesting that this is not, at least based on this is not just something, an artifact of how the disease is being coded, but actually you can see even when you're doing this long-term monitoring, and even in people that haven't been diagnosed before with atrial fibrillation, but using this more objective measure, you also find lower prevalence of AFib. Soon after this, there was another analysis published from the MESA cohort, which I also have mentioned. And also they used the same design. They also administered the Zio patch, or applied the Zio patch to the participants also for 2 weeks. And in this case, they didn't find significant differences in the prevalence of subclinical AF by race. One thing to notice, though, is that the number of participants in this study was much smaller, particularly among the African-American participants. And then this was only based on 26 cases of atrial fibrillation that, this was 14 cases of atrial fibrillation that were detected by the Zio patch. So it was a very small number compared to what Eric found, that found many more cases, not many more, but some more cases of atrial fibrillation, because it was a larger group. So even though there were no significant differences that you can see here, the prevalence was slightly lower. So that means that maybe with this data it's still a little inconsistent, but in general points, even if it's not significant, points in the same direction. And obviously this is just 2-week ECG monitoring. So for example, what would happen if we can use data from people that have some devices implanted that have been collecting information about the ECG, right? So there have been 2 studies that have used that kind of information to look at the burden of atrial fibrillation by race. Here you have results from these 2 studies. This one here to the left used data from Medicare beneficiaries with implanted cardiac devices, and this one here in the right used data of AFib patients of individuals with AFib with pacemakers, using data from California, Florida, and New York, also administrative databases, and identified people that had evidence of having a pacemaker, and then tried to see if there were differences in the rates of atrial fibrillation. So what you find in both studies is that even in people with ICDs or in people with pacemakers, the rates of detected atrial fibrillation, according to these 2 databases, was lower in Black individuals compared to white individuals, also pointing in the same direction of a lower burden of AFib overall in Black individuals compared to white people. Interestingly, obviously, all these studies have been done here in the US, and because we have a more diverse population and this can be explored. So there are not that many other settings that have been able to see if there are any kinds of racial or ethnic differences in the burden of atrial fibrillation. one of those places where we could look at these differences is the UK, because even if the UK has the majority of the population is white European ancestry, they have a large group of individuals who have moved to the US from different other parts of the world. So the UK Biobank that you probably most of you are familiar with includes 500,000 individuals, and even though 95% or more than 90% of the participants are white European, because the numbers of the participants is so large, even if you have a small percent of non-white people, you could still say something and you could look at that group and see if there are racial differences in any disease in this population. So this is what was done in this paper that was published just last year using data from the UK Biobank. You can see here in the top right, the table of number of participants by race and ethnicity based on self-reported information when participants enroll in the cohort, and then the number of events that were identified through 2020 in the cohort. So you can see, as looking at the crude numbers, that 2% of the white participants were diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, and that the number in the other groups was smaller. And when you calculate, in this case, they're calculating rate ratios of atrial fibrillation across the different groups, and when you adjust, even when you adjust for demographic variables and clinical variables, you can see that compared to the white participants in the cohort, Black participants, South Asian, Chinese, and those that identified as multiracial, all of them had low rates of atrial fibrillation, which is somewhat consistent with what we have seen in the US studies. And actually, I found there is another study that was published a few years ago. This one only includes South Asian and white individuals in the UK, in a specific area in the UK, and they look at EHR, at primary care records in this region to look at the differences in the prevalence of atrial fibrillation. This was just prevalence, not incidence, comparing South Asian and white individuals. And they found that across all the different age groups, the prevalence of atrial fibrillation also was lower in the South Asian participants than in the white participants. So it seems that this pattern that we see in many of these US studies is also present in other places where you can compare different racial and ethnic groups using kind of the same methodology to follow them. Because it's difficult when you're comparing different countries, for example, because if you do a study here in the US, it's going to be difficult even to compare with whatever is going on in the UK, because many times, because of the healthcare system and so on, that's going to be problematic to make those comparisons. So a lot of stuff showing you that there is something going on, that many of these studies have been showing, and the question is, why is this happening? Because it's contrary to what we would expect, right? So what explains this paradox? And first of all, I just want to make clear that when we talk about race or ethnicity, we are talking about a concept that is just social, that is going to be shaped here, for example, in the US, when we say that someone is white or Black or Hispanic, Asian, whatever, many times there are going to be those concepts are not just based on biology, or most of the cases are independent of biology and are based on historical, political, and social factors, rather than those innate biological differences. And because of that, we know that many times when we see racial health differences, for example, we compare cardiovascular mortality rates between white and Black people, many times those differences are not going to be based on differences in the biology, but are going to be, and there's a lot of studies showing that there can be multiple socioeconomic factors and sociocultural factors that can be affecting those differences. However, also we know that even though this raises this social construct, we know that there are going to be correlation between race and genetic ancestry. So individuals that self-identify as white, most likely, most of them are going to have higher degrees of European genetic ancestry versus someone who identifies as being Black or African American. They tend to have a higher degree of genetic African ancestry, right? So there's going to be that correlation. So that can give us also the opportunity to look at potential mechanisms that have to do with the genetic determinants of atrial fibrillation. So keeping those things in mind, I think that when we talk about what is explaining this, different people have exposed different potential explanations for it. And I think that we can talk about three main factors that could explain that. One is that maybe there are genetic factors that are going to be correlated with ancestry, whether it's European ancestry or African ancestry, Asian ancestry, that may contribute to these differences. It could be that maybe there are social determinants of health. For example, you could think that because of the character of atrial fibrillation as something that requires healthcare access to be diagnosed, and then maybe the quality of your healthcare access and the healthcare you receive is going to affect your probability of being properly diagnosed. There could be factors that in individuals of lower socioeconomic status, maybe you have a lower detection rates of atrial fibrillation, and that can explain the paradox, and many people think that this is all based on that. And also another aspect to consider is that because atrial fibrillation occurs mostly in people that are 65, 70 and older, if you have differences by race in mortality rates, maybe what may be happening is that if, for example, we see that there are higher rates of cardiovascular mortality in Black people compared to white people, if those people who die from cardiovascular disease earlier in life are the ones that were supposed to be susceptible to developing atrial fibrillation, then you find that there is less atrial fibrillation in older individuals in a particular race group, not because they have a lower risk of atrial fibrillation, but because they just didn't make it to be old enough to develop atrial fibrillation. So that could be another explanation. So let's now look at some of the epidemiological studies and clinical studies that have tried to address these different hypotheses. So first of all, I'm going to focus on some of the work that has been done that focuses on issues around genetic ancestry and the risk of atrial fibrillation. So here you have the results from a study that we published some time ago now, that this was led by Greg Marcus at UCSF. And this analysis used data from the ECCRI and the cardiovascular health study cohort, which is also an NHLBI funded cohort. In both cohorts included white and Black participants. And for this analysis, specifically, the analysis only included the Black participants within the two cohorts, which were around 4,300 individuals. In this analysis, there were around 300 cases of incident atrial fibrillation. And all these participants had provided DNA, and it was possible to determine using different genotyping approaches to get the degree of global ancestry in these individuals. And what you know is that the African American population here in the US has some degree of admixture between populations of African ancestry and European ancestry, right? So you're going to be able within the population within African American individuals to determine the degree of European ancestry, and you can use that as a variable that you could use in the analysis. So this is what this analysis did just within the Black participants in these two cohorts. We measured the degree of European ancestry within those participants, and you can see that on average in the ECCRI cohort, the degree of European ancestry was 17% versus 24% in the CHS cohort. And then we calculated what was the hazard ratio of atrial fibrillation per 10% increase in European ancestry within the Black participants of the cohorts. And what you can see here, looking at these two estimates, is that in both cases, in both cohorts, higher degree of European ancestry was associated with a higher risk of atrial fibrillation. Right, so which will be consistent with the idea that you find in white individuals that mostly are going to be from European ancestry, you have a higher risk of atrial fibrillation. So there is this will support that kind of the observations seen in epidemiological studies, and it will point to maybe something related to ancestry, some genetic factor related to ancestry that may be explaining this association. A few years after that, there was this other analysis that was published in the using data from the Women's Health Initiative study, which is obviously only includes women. This was part of the Women's Health Initiative, which was the large trial that looked at hormone therapy and diet and a few other things. But as part of this study, this large trial, there also was an observational cohort component and an analysis just focusing on the African American women participating in this analysis, in this study, found that also using the same approach of getting the degree of global European ancestry in the population, which was similar to what we had seen in the other two cohorts, around 17%. Actually, in this study, they didn't find that genetic European genetic ancestry was associated with atrial fibrillation. So in this case, the odds ratio per 10% increase in European ancestry was 0.99, basically no association. One thing to notice about this analysis compared to the other analysis in the ERIC and CHS cohort is that a majority of the participants that had AFib in this analysis had prevalent atrial fibrillation. And the reason why this may be relevant is that maybe if the factors associated with the risk of atrial fibrillation and also associated with survival and time living with atrial fibrillation, then that might, when you are doing this kind of cross-sectional analysis in which more the cases are, most of the cases have AF, that might maybe remove some of the association, and I will show you that in just a little later. So we have this study, ERIC and analysis in the ERIC and CHS cohorts that point in one direction, and then this other analysis actually had a larger number of cases, but most of them being prevalent, that didn't show any association. And after this, there hasn't been any other publication that has specifically looked at this question. Recently, in preparation for a grant application, I talked with Janssen, that many of you know, and then Chang Liu, who is also a faculty member in epidemiology that has worked with some of you, to see if we could do something similar, but in the UK Biobank, because again, in the UK Biobank, even if they don't have a very large Black population, they have some numbers, and obviously they have genetic data. So Chang has been doing this analysis in the UK Biobank, and here basically you can see this is so you can see the distribution of European ancestry within the 7,000 participants that were eligible for this analysis. So obviously most of the participants in this cohort that self-identified Black individuals have 0% of European ancestry, right? They are 100% African ancestry, but you can see that there is a wide degree of variability, and there is definitely enough variability to be able to study these questions. And then she did this analysis, and in the analysis in which she adjusted for demographic and cardiovascular risk factors that included 174 events, we found a hazard ratio of 1.1 with this confidence interval, which is not significant with the traditional cutoff point. And you can see that there is some variability depending on what you adjust for and so on. So what we did is that, this is a small study, only 174 cases, so not a lot. But one thing that you can see here is that when we put all these results together, and this is just a meta-analysis that we ran using data from ERIC, CHS, our analysis in the UK Biobank, and then the Women's Health Initiative study, you can see if you did the traditional meta-analysis, you could find something that is, if you want, significant or barely significant. But the important thing about this is that when we look at the heterogeneity in the studies, we see that there is a high degree of heterogeneity. And the main reason why we have that is because we have this one study that is kind of apart from the other three studies. And obviously, this is the largest study, so it's going to have a lot of weight in the meta-analysis. If you look at the weight in a traditional meta-analysis, it's over 2/3. And we don't know why this is so different from these other three. And my suspicion is that it has to do with the fact that it's including mostly prevalent cases and not incident cases. I contacted the first author of the paper, Marco Perez at Stanford, to see if they, by any chance, they will be able to do separate analysis. But he said that they did this analysis a long time ago, and no, the answer was no. So it's, if someone has access to this data, wants to do it, that will be an interesting thing to do. So that's what we have seen in some of these studies. There was a follow-up study to the ERIC analysis and CHS analysis that focused on ancestry, and this was published now almost 10 years ago in JAMA Cardiology. And the idea in the previous analysis that I have shown you just looks at global ancestry, and you get an estimate for your DNA that tells you how European you are, or how African you are, or Asian, whatever, right? Which is what they use when they are doing the ancestry.com kind of analysis, right? But also you can take into account that variation within the genome some variation within the genome is strongly linked to ancestry. So you can use that ancestry-related variation within the genome to try to identify whether there are specific genomic areas that are associated with a particular outcome. So, and that's what is called admixture mapping, that takes into account that variation in admixed populations like the African American population in the US, and could also be done in the Hispanic population in the US that also has a lot of admixture between European, African, and some Asian ancestry, Native American. So you can do that to see if there are specific regions that are linked with the risk of atrial fibrillation. So using data from ERIC CHS and Health ABC, also the same group that did the initial ancestry analysis, looked at whether doing a genome-wide admixture mapping analysis or local ancestry analysis, there was a specific region that was linked with atrial fibrillation risk. And the main result is that this analysis didn't find anything that met the statistical threshold that you will require in a genome-wide study. So, and again, after this, there haven't been any other studies really looking at this. So just the evidence about genetic ancestry and atrial fibrillation is not 100% going in the same direction. So there are some questions about that, and definitely there may be additional studies that could be done to try to determine whether this is one of the potential mechanisms explaining this. The other aspect that has been the other potential hypothesis that has been proposed to explain this paradoxical association between race and atrial fibrillation risk has to do with social determinants of health, access to healthcare, and as a consequence of that, potential underascertainment and underdiagnosis of atrial fibrillation in some groups compared to others, right? So based on that, you will expect that then, if that was the case, that in individuals with lower socioeconomic status that potentially are going to have or lower access to good quality healthcare, you may find lower prevalence of atrial fibrillation. But actually, when we look at, for example, we did an analysis in the ERIC cohort looking at racial differences in AFib risk according to socioeconomic status level. And this is looking at, here in the right, you have by education, and here in the left, you have by income. And across categories of education or categories of income, the rates of atrial fibrillation were always lower in the Black participants compared to the white participants. And even though it's not super clear, the pattern, you can see still that in general, individuals with lower education tended to have higher rates of atrial fibrillation compared to those with higher education, right? So you can see here, and for income is less clear, but definitely for education, you can see that pattern, which is the same pattern that we see for most other cardiovascular diseases and cardiovascular risk factors, right? I did this is looking at Cosmos data. So one of the things about the EPIC Cosmos data is that it has this very large sample size, and obviously has the limitations of using information that is recorded in the EHR, but some of the information that you can get obviously is basic demographic information, including age, sex, and race of and ethnicity of individuals in Cosmos. The other thing that you can get in a very sizable number of individuals in EPIC Cosmos is that you can get information on their area deprivation index, which is a measure of neighborhood socioeconomic status, if you want. For example, the Emory patients don't have that available in Cosmos, but you still have it like for almost 1/3 of EPIC Cosmos participants. So what you can see, and this is an analysis that was just looking at the proportion, the prevalence of atrial fibrillation by race, sex, and decile of area deprivation index. So the area deprivation index is going to be higher in individuals that have worse neighborhood socioeconomic status. That means that there is more deprivation, right? And this is at the national level. So the 90 or more will be the most deprived neighborhoods, 10 or less will be the more affluent, less deprived neighborhoods. So what you can see and this is just crude data in the sense that it's not adjusted for clinical risk factors or even age, because it's very difficult to do when you just have access to the slicer and you don't have access to the actual raw data that is underlying that. But you can see overall is that that the same pattern that we have seen in many other studies by race, you can see it also here. NHW is non-Hispanic whites. This will be non-Hispanic other race. Is this American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic Asian, and Hispanic. And you can see how the highest prevalence of atrial fibrillation is in this group. And the other thing is that you can see that even not very strong, you can see that there is kind of a pattern with higher prevalence in general in most groups in those places with more deprivation, right? So you can see it better for the non-Hispanic white, but also you can see that in general for all the other groups, there is that trend. And even in the most affluent neighborhoods, if you want, you can still see the same pattern that you could see in these other places. And obviously, these are all people that have data in Epic Cosmos, so they all have some degree of access to healthcare. And in general, you will say that probably maybe this doesn't support the idea that this is just under ascertainment or under diagnosis. So that's for that. And then the final alternative hypothesis for this is about competing risk and early mortality, right? And again, as I was mentioning, this will be that because mortality rates and rates of other CVDs are higher in Black than white individuals, maybe there is because of that, you are going to have a reduction in the high risk susceptible individuals that will eventually develop atrial fibrillation when they get to be 70, 75, and so on. So what can we do to see whether this is true or not? So one possibility is looking at, for example, this is again looking at a ECCRI cohort, and you can see, because we reported age-specific rates, you can see that even in the younger age groups, which doesn't go very young, but you have very few cases in people younger than 45, but even in the group that was 45 to 59, you already see that there are some differences at least in that analysis, in the rates of atrial fibrillation by race that follow the same pattern that you will see in the older groups. The problem with this analysis is that this is based in very, very, very small number of cases, because you didn't have that many cases, particularly among the Black participants. I mean, it can be like 4 or 5 cases only in this age group. There was an analysis that was published more than 20 years ago now that used data from the Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. This JAMA paper in 2001, that they had this in one paragraph, and it was kind of hidden there, and they didn't really highlight it. But they also look at the prevalence of AFib by race, and they looked at the prevalence of AFib by race and age groups. And what you can see here is what was that prevalence? Again, it's prevalence, not incidence, in Black and white individuals within Kaiser Permanente, but by different age groups. And you can see that in the older individuals, that's where you see the strongest difference in the prevalence between Black and white people, right? And then when you get to the younger individuals, and they went all the way to 50 to 59 years of age, in this case, again, you have very small number of cases and you don't see much of a difference, right? And you can see how the difference increases. So there may be something going on about that can explain what's happening here. It might be also that you have to keep in mind that obviously atrial fibrillation occurring in someone who is 50 or 55 can be a different type of atrial fibrillation than what you will see in someone who is 65, 70, that has some degree of heart failure, have multiple risk factors, and so on, right? So that can be also what addresses that. And finally, I did some quick analysis also looking at Epic Cosmos, which just using the slicer dicer, so it has limitations because of that. Basically using the same, looking at the prevalence of AFib by age and sex and by race. And then obviously what we have is that we have a small prevalence of AFib in those age groups, but because Epic Cosmos has this very humongous size of the population, I mean, you have data on over 200 million people, you can actually look at the prevalence, in this case of atrial fibrillation, across those groups. So what you have here is in males and females separately, what I'm presenting here, instead of presenting the actual prevalence, because it will be very difficult to see differences when you start going up in age, I'm showing you the relative risk of the prevalence ratio of atrial fibrillation by age group, comparing non-Hispanic Blacks, which will be the orange one, non-Hispanic Asians is this green line, and then Hispanic individual could be this blue line, and the reference could be non-Hispanic white individuals. So what you can see is that for non-Hispanic Asian and Hispanic individuals across all the age groups, actually the prevalence ratios of AFib were lower, both in males and females. For the non-Hispanic Black individuals, what you can see is this pattern, that there is no difference in younger individuals or even in females. You can see that there is a slightly higher prevalence. And then is that when you get to the older cases that you start to see this pattern. One thing to notice is that this is telling you the proportion of AF cases by age group. So the more than 50% of the cases, both in females and males, occur in people 70 and older, right? And it's only this small percent, not so small, but this is a small percent compared to all the cases of atrial fibrillation that occurs in older age groups, in younger age groups. So again, this is something that, you look at this, and I mean, this is an analysis that again is not adjusting for cardiovascular risk factors or anything else. So, but it's suggesting that maybe there is something about this early mortality, or maybe, again, we are talking about earlier in life, there is AFib has a much stronger genetic component than later in life. Maybe that's why you don't see that difference. I don't know, but this is intriguing. All right, so this is all what I had to say about how we find this interesting paradox in the association between race and the risk of atrial fibrillation, which is different from what we see for many other cardiovascular diseases. However, I wanted to have like a couple of slides, and maybe then we can have questions and discussion if you want, just to highlight that even though we see those differences in early life, we also see that there are important disparities in outcomes and treatment in atrial fibrillation, in which we actually see the same patterns that we see for other cardiovascular diseases, for example, for heart failure, stroke, MI, etc. And specifically looking at disparities in outcomes in atrial fibrillation, what we see here in the US is that when we compare Black individuals to white individuals with atrial fibrillation, rates of stroke are higher in the Black patients than white patients among those that have atrial fibrillation. So, for example, this was an analysis done in Medicare data now some years ago that found almost this 50% higher risk of a stroke in those that had atrial fibrillation. This is an analysis that we did in the ECCRI cohort, looking at rates of stroke and mortality in white participants and Black participants with and without atrial fibrillation. And we found, not surprisingly, I guess, is that the highest rates of stroke and mortality were in Black individuals with AFib, and which were much higher than in those with white individuals with AFib, and then obviously much higher than in those without atrial fibrillation. And then when you look at the differences between the impact that the stroke that AFib was having on the risk of a stroke, the risk of mortality, overall mortality, and then also looking at heart failure and CHD, we found that actually Black race was much stronger, that AFib was a much stronger risk factor for all these outcomes among Black individuals compared to white individuals. This is an analysis that we did in the Optum database, which is a large claims database that has information on race. And we also found that comparing to white patients in this large cohort, this is all people with atrial fibrillation, Black individuals had a 44% increased risk of a stroke, 45% risk of heart failure, and a 12% risk of MI higher than white participants with MI. So we see that there are still important disparities there, that even though Black individuals seem to have lower rates of atrial fibrillation, once they have atrial fibrillation, their outcomes are actually worse than in white people. And the reasons why this is happening, there could be multiple, but there have been some studies that have looked at treatments that patients with AF are receiving and whether we have disparities there. So, for example, this is a study using data from the VA, and in this case, they were looking at the probability of receiving oral anticoagulation in general, and then also the probability of receiving direct oral anticoagulants in people with atrial fibrillation. They found that Black patients with AF had lower rates of anticoagulation and also lower rates of receiving direct oral anticoagulants, and then this was there when you adjusted for multiple variables. And this is in theory a group of patients that are receiving the same kind of care, right? And then also there have been analysis looking at rhythm control in patients with atrial fibrillation. This is an analysis from the Get With the Guidelines AFib registry, looking at any rhythm control in general and different types of rhythm control occurring during hospitalizations for atrial fibrillation. So you can see that in Black patients with AFib that were admitted with AFib at the hospital, they had in general lower probability of receiving rhythm control therapy compared to white patients, and that this was the case for cardioversion in hospital rhythm medications, and then there was no significant differences for rhythm control plan. They also look at in hospital catheter ablation, but I guess that the number of those was probably very low, and they were not presenting it here specifically for that. So in conclusion, just this have it here. So we know that we can have seen multiple studies. Hopefully you believe all the data. I've shown you that there are marked patterns of AFib risk by race and ethnicity. In general, across multiple studies, it looks like this incidence is higher in white individuals compared to Black, Asian, and Hispanic people. Then we don't know really why. There have been different patterns, that hypotheses that have been explored, but I don't think that we have anyone that really explains all these observations. And also just to highlight that even though we see that specifically for the risk of atrial fibrillation, that once someone has atrial fibrillation, we also see disparities by race that are consistent with what we see for other cardiovascular diseases. So with that, I'll finish, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts and have a conversation with you.
Can I start?
Mm-hmm.
So, the factors that we think are associated with atrial fibrillation, you cover some of them, but there are others.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering whether those might explain some. So, for example, height.
Mm-hmm.
All of people.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
People are born.
Yeah.
And high, which is sort of large left atrial size.
Mm-hmm.
Mystophobia, hypertension. So those two things probably go against this hypothesis. In other words, on average, are probably tolerate this outside. I'm sure that helps.
So just going with the height thing. So actually, that's interesting because one thing that we have seen is that we know that taller people have a higher risk of atrial fibrillation, and in veterinarians know that very well because small animals don't get AFib, large animals get AFib. And when you look at dog breeds, small dogs don't get AFib, large dogs get AFib, and that has been described. You can go to PubMed and look into that, and there is a correlation because it's mostly that the larger your heart is, the higher your risk of developing AF. So, and we know from epidemiologic studies that in humans also taller people have higher risk of AF. And actually, there are multiple analyses that have shown that the sex difference that we see in the rates of atrial fibrillation are probably mostly explained by height. That because males on average are taller than females, when you put height into the equation, the sex difference goes away. In the US, for example, in the ECCRI cohort, the Black participants in the ECCRI cohort on average are shorter than the white participants. So that actually could explain why they have lower atrial fibrillation. But even when we adjust for height, you still see that. So that's probably not enough to explain that. There have been some studies that have used echocardiographic data to see, for example, differences in left atrial size and volume and all these things, and trying to see if that is enough. And there are some differences that maybe can be explained by difference in body size, but again, that hasn't been really enough to explain the difference. And obviously, the hypertension is higher in here in the US. We know that prevalence of hypertension is higher, and definitely, even though you have that, you still have lower rates. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with alcohol, we don't, in many of these studies, don't have enough, because with alcohol, the association is mostly with excessive alcohol amount. When you're thinking about, for AFib specifically, you're thinking about moderate alcohol consumption, is difficult to find association, and there is not a strong evidence. Obviously, there is evidence that people who have a lot of, and that has been, that has been the holiday heart thing that you have all learned in school, that has been there for decades now. And now there is evidence, actually, there's a randomized trial in people that had AFib, was published in New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago, that were randomized to alcohol abstention or control, and those that were in the same group, actually, they decreased their alcohol intake and they had lower rates of AFib recurrence. So definitely there is not enough differences in the alcohol intake to explain that. And with the sleep apnea, that's a good question. The problem with most EPI studies, I have looked at sleep apnea as a risk factor for AFib, even though you know that people with the sleep apnea have higher prevalence, right? The problem is that that's always very strongly confounded by obesity and hypertension and all the other things. So there was an analysis published a few years ago using data from the Sleep Heart Health study. That is this NHLBI funded cohort that got data from multiple NHLBI cohorts, Eric, CHS, Framingham, and others that had with participants that had polysomnographic studies. And actually, they didn't find any association between obstructive sleep apnea and AFib risk. What they found, that I don't know why, and haven't seen it replicated anywhere, they found a higher risk of AFib associated with central sleep apnea, which is once talking with Amit Shah, he was saying, there's something that can be related to the autonomic nervous system that actually could explain that association. But even though in the literature, people say, well, sleep apnea is a risk factor for AFib, the actual evidence showing you that obstructive sleep apnea is a risk factor for AFib is actually quite thin once you take into account all the things that go in. No, but the problem is that the people with the sleep apnea all have obesity and have all these other cardiovascular risk factors. So the problem is that how do you disentangle those two things, right? Or 3, 4 things.
So, Álvaro, so I have a question. Thank you for a very nice presentation, by the way. Really very, very nicely put together. So the data you presented towards the end showing that the relationship by race varies with age, meaning that it kind of in younger age groups, you don't really see differences, but those differences appear during in the older groups. Can you hear me?
We cannot hear you. Viola, do you mind trying again?
Okay, can you hear me? Sorry.
Not really. This
That is interesting. My microphone is active here, so I'm not sure.
Write it down.
Okay, well, I guess I put my message in the chat.
no, because that's not. Oh, maybe. Oh, let's see. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I was first of all,
It's not your
thanking you.
fault.
Thanking you for the presentation. And so my comment is about the data you showed towards the end, where you can see this difference by age, so that in the younger groups, actually, you don't see much of a difference between races, but it's mostly in the older age groups. So that kind of reminds me the so-called age crossover for race differences in cardiovascular disease, where you can actually see an increased risk for Black people, mostly in the younger age groups, and kind of disappears in the older age groups. So to me, that kind of, perhaps there are really no real differences in AFib between races, between Blacks and Black and white people. It's just what you mentioned in the beginning, that the high-risk Black people are not there anymore because AFib is a disease of older age. So the high-risk group in the Black population has already been removed, has already died, or has other comorbidities or other things. So it's essentially not contributing to the differences. What do you think about that? Maybe it could be just that.
So it could be just that. I just think that the rates of AFib in that younger group and the mortality rates in that younger group probably are not enough to explain why you will see that strong difference in other groups, because we don't see that for rates of stroke, right? If you will expect that if that was the explanation, most of the ischemic stroke that we see in the population are also occurring in people 70 and 75, and still we find higher rates of ischemic stroke in Black people compared to white people. So even though if it explains some of it, I don't think it's just the magnitude of that mortality attrition is enough, but that's something that could be explored. The other thing is that I just think that the AFib that occurs in younger age groups is just different from what happens in other age groups. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, sort of related to what you just said, at least clinically, young people that get AFib tend to be pretty profoundly symptomatic. Old people who get AFib tend not to be symptomatic. They're often diagnosed incidentally. I wonder whether some of this disparity may just be an issue of who's going to the doctor when, how carefully they're going to get looked at. Like a lot of the, if it's a sort of, if it could be related as much to kind of access and interaction as anything else. I mean, you look at, for example, just one other condition that I think is really interesting. When you look at reported rates of aortic stenosis, mitral regurgitation, these are things where we see these enormous racial discrepancies, but no physiologic basis for why these things happen. And I think most people think in those cases it's because of under observation and under detection as opposed to differences. And I wonder whether some of the same.
Yeah.
When a 40-year-old gets AFib, they go to the doctor to feel careful. 75, 80-year-old, it's usually not. So they present different.
Yeah.
I don't know if that plays a role.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, and some people just think that it's all data. The other thing is that you still have the studies that have looked at the extended ECG monitoring that is independent of whether you know when you have
so those would be
and then you have the pacemaker and all this other thing that again is independent and you see that. So I just don't think that that's enough because we have all these other studies, even though could explain some of this. And again, I think that Viola, I think that what you mentioned is a valid point. And this is an analysis that I just did basically using crude data, which is not adjusted for anything. So there are issues with that, but that's something to think more about what that means, this susceptibility, and see if that could explain all of it or not, because it's a very clear pattern that you see for non-Hispanic Blacks that you don't see for any other group, and has been seen for other things too.
We have one more question from Amber. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, Álvaro, this is fascinating. If I may, ask two questions. One, we are lumping like different kind of AFibs together in most of these analyses, right? Although you mentioned a little bit about paroxysmal AFib and permanent AFib, in one study where event monitor was used. So wanted to just delve. Could it be possible that Blacks have more paroxysmal AFib that's less easily detected? Is that the thing? And the other thing is in whites, there's so much of more endurance activities like running, skiing, and all that kind of thing, and that makes them more prone to AFib. I don't know if these studies adjust for the physical activity and the kind of physical activity they do.
Yeah, no, just going with the last thing. I mean, we know, right, that endurance athletes like cross-country skiers, marathon runners, they are going to have higher risk, and many times that's due to high risk of AF. That's many times due to larger enlargement of the left atrium. It tends to be early onset AF rather than the traditional AF that we see in older people, and that actually that's something that resolves better with ablation if they need to and everything else. So the pathophysiology is different. It tends to be not younger individuals, and not definitely the kind of AF that you see in the 65, 70, 75-year-old. Most of them are not cross-country skiers. So it's true that's the case. In most epidemiological studies, you have a very, very small number of people that will be in that extreme physical activity category. And even when you look at the clinical cohorts, most of the patients are not there. So that couldn't be probably, even if the prevalence is higher in white people than older individuals, when we look at the EPI studies that have data on physical activity and we adjust for that, that's not enough. The one thing about the paroxysmal versus persistent AF, it's true that there could be differences. Most studies don't have that kind of information. The studies that rely on getting data from claims data or just getting a rough diagnosis of AFib, yes or no, they are not going to have that. Here in this slide, you have the data from the ERIC study that use the CO patch, and they were able to get continuous and intermittent AF, if you want, which is not the same. Intermittent is not the same as paroxysmal, because there were some people with paroxysmal AF that probably didn't have paroxysmal AF that didn't have an episode during the 2 weeks when they were wearing the CO patch, right? So this is people, and you can see that when you look at whether it was intermittent or continuous, you saw the same. There were both differences between white and Black participants. This would be the people that were 100% AFib during the 2 weeks, you see much larger differences here, particularly in the male group, but even in the case of intermittent AF, which is people that had just less than 100%, which in most cases was 1-2% burden of AFib during the entire period, you also see those differences. So it is possible that differences between paroxysmal and permanent could explain that, but maybe not enough based on some of this data.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amber. I know it's after 3, and probably you guys want to go and do something else, which makes sense.
Another meeting, that's all.
Oh, excellent. Next calls. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.